In a hall where power and appearance are worth more than humanity, a man marked by his own surname is rejected before everyone, as if he were invisible, or worse, unwanted. Surrounded by cold looks and cruel smiles, he discovers that the true weight of his history is not in his enemies but in absolute isolation. When all seems lost, a single woman decides to defy the collective silence and crosses the hall, completely changing the course of that night. What begins with a simple gesture transforms into a dangerous connection, capable of confronting the past, loyalty, and everything he believed was impossible to escape. Before discovering how this unexpected choice can rewrite destinies and defy an empire built on fear, don't forget to subscribe for more intense stories full of twists. The Santa Veronica farm was the type of place that made people forget that a world existed beyond its gates. Situated on the outskirts of Rio Verde, in the heart of the Goiás Cerrado, the property extended over more than 12,000 hectares of productive land, crossed by rivers of crystal-clear water, and shaded by yellow ipés that bloomed as if they knew they were part of a scenery. On that May night, however, the beauty of the Cerrado took a back seat. What mattered was the hall. The ball of the traditional agribusiness families had been taking place for 42 years. It was the most anticipated event on the social calendar of the Goiás interior, a night where alliances were sealed not with contracts, but with handshakes and invitations to dance. Women arrived with dresses ordered months in advance. Men adjusted their tuxedos with the same seriousness with which they signed land deeds. And among all of them, stories circulated about fortunes, about families, about names that were worth more than any currency. Henrique Valadares Monteiro entered the hall at exactly 9 o'clock, with the punctuality of someone still trying to maintain some control over appearances. He was 36 years old, with broad shoulders and a face that held the same austerity as his father's, the same firm jaw, the same dark eyes that seemed to calculate everything before deciding anything. He wore a carefully chosen navy blue tuxedo and carried in his manners the silent attempt to look exactly like what he needed to look like, a man in order. He was not. 3 weeks earlier, his father, Dirceu Valadares Monteiro, had been compulsorily removed from the presidency of the Agrocentro-Oeste Consortium after an internal investigation revealed accounting irregularities of proportions that no one in the sector wanted to pronounce out loud. There was no public trial, no scandal splashed in the newspaper, but in the closed world of the Goiás agribusiness families, silence spoke louder than any headline. Everyone knew. And everyone had decided, collectively and without formal deliberation, what to do with that knowledge, distance themselves. Henrique knew he was entering hostile territory. He knew that smiles would be smaller, that glances would last fractions of a second less than normal, that conversations would have the exact duration necessary so that no one seemed rude, but no one seemed close. He had calculated this risk. He decided to attend anyway, because absence would be worse. Absence would be admission. The first 40 minutes went as expected. He greeted the Braga Cavalcante family with 2 kisses and a smile that did not reach the eyes of either side. He exchanged words with Ronaldo Serafim, who directed the entire conversation toward the soybean harvest and diverted the topic every time Henrique tried to bring it closer to common business. He drank a glass of mineral water because he knew he would need clear reflexes for what came next. What came was the music. The orchestra, hired from Goiânia, began a slow waltz, and the hall reorganized itself naturally, couples forming, hands meeting, the silent ritual of those who dance not just for pleasure, but for social positioning. It was the moment when alliances became visible, and Henrique, standing by the synthetic marble column that supported the floral decoration, realized he was alone in a way that was not just geographical. He approached Fernanda Galvão, daughter of one of the largest corn producers in southwest Goiás, with whom he had danced 3 times at the previous year's ball. She saw him coming, and something passed across her face, not exactly fear, not exactly contempt, but a managed mixture of the two that resulted in an apologetic smile and an excuse about a sprained ankle. Henrique nodded as if he believed her. He tried with Camila Roriz, with Beatriz Lacerda, with a young woman he didn't even know well, the daughter of someone from Jatai whose name he couldn't remember. Each refusal had its own texture, some gentler, others more hurried, all absolutely unequivocal in their meaning. Around him, the smiles of his rivals grew with the discreet restraint of those who know they are winning without needing to declare war. Gilberto Paraños, who disputed with the Valadares Montero family for hegemony over 3 municipalities in the region, watched from afar with a glass of whiskey in his hand and an expression of satisfaction so poorly disguised that it was offensive. Henrique did not look at him more than once. He would not give him that pleasure. It was then that he decided to leave. There was nothing left to prove that night, and staying there was accumulating defeat upon defeat. He went to the table where he had left his jacket, picked it up with controlled movements, and was about to turn his back on the hall when he heard footsteps. They were not the hurried steps of a waiter, nor the rhythmic click of the heels of the women circulating. They were direct, deliberate steps that crossed the space with a calmness that drew attention precisely because it was unusual in that environment of calculated affectation. He turned around. The woman walking toward him was about 30 years old, maybe a little more. She wore a dark green dress, simple in structure but precise in its cut, and did not carry any of the excessive accessories that marked the style of the other guests. Her hair was tied up in a functional way, as if she had arranged it with care but without ostentation. Her face was serious, not closed, but serious in the way of someone who is used to thinking before speaking. She stopped in front of him, and without preamble, without the protocol smile that preceded any interaction in that hall, she said only, "Are you still going to dance this waltz, or have you already given up?" Henrique stood still for a second that seemed to last much longer. Around them he could feel the weight of the glances turning, discreet, calibrated, but present. All those people who had refused to look at him were looking now, because there was something disturbing about seeing someone approach the untouchable without hesitation. He did not know her. He didn't know her name, didn't know her family, didn't know what brought her to that ball or what had led her to him. But there was something in the firmness of that invitation, in the absence of fear, in the refusal to be part of the collective choreography of exclusion, that made him drop his jacket on the chair and extend his hand. "I haven't given up on anything," he said. And they went to dance. The floor opened up for them in the way floors open up when something unexpected happens. Not dramatically, not with a visible retreat, but with that subtle adjustment of those who need to reorganize their visual field to process what they are seeing. Henrique felt this without needing to look around. He had spent years learning to read environments, to calibrate the weight of each look even before identifying its origin. The hall was processing. "Do you dance often?" he asked, more to inhabit the silence than because the answer mattered much. "Rarely," she admitted, "but I'm not afraid to start when it feels right." Around them, Henrique noticed that the conversations had readjusted. People were not looking ostentatiously. No one in that environment would be rude enough for that. But there was that lateral attention out of the corner of the eye, which is how elegant environments gossip, discreetly, in a way that everyone sees without anyone having to admit they saw. Gilberto Paraños had stopped smiling completely. Fernanda Galvão, who had invented the sprained ankle, was talking to someone, but with an imbalance of attention that revealed half of her consciousness was on the dance floor. Henrique let them notice. There was something liberating about simply letting it be. The waltz lasted 4 minutes. At the end, when the orchestra paused and the polite applause of the hall filled the silence, the two of them remained for a moment still standing in front of each other, their hands only slightly separated. "Thank you," she said, with the simplicity of someone who thanks without exaggeration. "It should be me thanking you," he said. She tilted her head slightly, like someone accepting a correction, and then looked at him in a way he could only describe as direct. Not invasive, not calculated, but genuinely curious, as if she were seeing not the surface he had built over the years to circulate in those environments, but something beyond it. Dancing with her was different from what Henrique had expected, although he didn't know exactly what he had expected. She was not a skilled dancer in the technical sense. She didn't have the trained lightness of women who had taken classes since adolescence, but she followed the rhythm with genuine attention, as if she were completely present in that moment and nowhere else at the same time. There was something refreshing about it, something he couldn't name immediately, but that he felt as a physical relief, like dropping the weight of a suitcase he had carried too far. "You're not from here," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she confirmed without offense. "I'm from Brasilia. I came for work." "What kind of work brings someone to a farmer's ball in the interior of Goiás?" She let a brief smile pass. "The kind that requires understanding how things work before opining on them. I'm a corporate governance consultant. I was hired by one of the groups present here to do an internal audit. I prefer not to say which one." Henrique nodded slowly. Corporate governance. The expression landed between them with a specific weight, because he knew better than anyone what that kind of work usually preceded and what it usually left behind. "And the ball is part of the audit?" "The ball is part of understanding the culture," she said, with a naturalness that had no irony, but also no naivety. "Businesses of this magnitude do not exist outside of social relations. Who dances with whom, who avoids whom, who stands near the window holding an empty glass for 20 minutes. It all tells a story." He looked at her with more attention. "And what is today's story telling you? That you have enemies who prefer to see you humiliated than to confront you directly," she replied without looking away. "And that you are too proud to leave early, which reveals that you still care about what these people think, even if you pretend not to care." The frankness was so unexpected that he didn't immediately know how to react. He was used to people who picked their words with tweezers, who wrapped any truth in so many layers of courtesy that it arrived unrecognizable. That woman had said in 30 seconds what anyone else would take an hour of tortuous conversation not to say. "Do you have a name?" he asked. "Mariana Furtado." "Henrique Valadares Monteiro." "I know who you are," she said. "It's also part of the job." The waltz came to an end, and the orchestra took a break for a few minutes. Henrique didn't let go of her hand immediately, and she didn't pull back either. They stood still in the middle of the floor while the other couples dispersed, and there was in that moment a kind of involuntary bubble around the two of them, the kind that forms when two people have a real conversation in a place where no one else is having one. "Why did you come to me?" he finally asked. Everyone here was making a point of not coming. Mariana considered her answer for a moment. "Because I saw what they were doing, and I thought it was cowardly. Collective rejection is not a moral judgment. It's social comfort. People were distancing themselves from you not because they reached some ethical conclusion about your situation, but because it's safer to walk with the majority. That bothers me more than anything you might have done or not done." "You don't know what I did or didn't do." "No," she agreed. "And would you invite me for a coffee tomorrow morning if I wanted to understand better?" The question arrived with the same directness of everything she had said up to that point, and Henrique realized that it was this, the absence of games, of maneuvers, of camouflaged ulterior motives, that made that conversation different from any other he had had in a long time. In the world he lived in, every word was a piece on a board. Mariana seemed not to be playing. "Yes," he said, "I would." They exchanged contacts with the practical brevity of people who have things to do, and Mariana said goodbye with a simple wave, without the prolonged farewell that the women in that environment usually performed. Henrique stood where he was for a few moments, looking at the space where she had been, and then noticed that Gilberto Paranhos had stopped smiling. Small victories, he thought, but victories. He didn't sleep well that night. The room he occupied in the guest wing of the Santa Veronica farm was large and silent, with windows overlooking the pasture and the distant smell of wet earth that the Cerrado releases after the off-season rains. He lay on his back looking at the ceiling and thinking about things he had tried not to think about for weeks. His father's removal had arrived like a wave he didn't see forming, although, looking back, the evidence was all there. Dirceu Valadares Monteiro was a man of old methods who understood agribusiness as he understood life, as a territory to be dominated with the available tools, without excessive attention to the rules he considered decorative. Henrique had always known this. He had tried in the last 5 years to modernize the family group's practices without confronting his father directly, without breaking what could not be broken from within. He hadn't succeeded in time. Now the Valadares Montero name carried a weight he hadn't chosen, but that was his by inheritance. And he was tired, not of the fight, but of the specific loneliness of fighting from within something that seemed to be collapsing from the outside. He thought of Mariana Furtado and the way she had crossed that hall without asking anyone's permission. For the first time in weeks, he fell asleep without having to force it. The next day, at 8 in the morning, she arrived at the cafe in the Rio Verde Hotel, where she was staying 15 minutes early with a notebook under her arm. Henrique arrived on time and found her already seated, with coffee in front of her, and her gaze turned toward the street. She wasn't looking at her cell phone, she was just looking like someone who still knows how to be still. "You came," she said when he sat down. "I said I would." People say a lot of things at balls. He ordered coffee and was silent for a moment, organizing what he wanted to say, or deciding if he wanted to say anything at all or just listen. Finally, he chose honesty in the same way she had chosen it the night before. "My father made a mistake, not accidentally. He erred systematically for years, thinking the consequences were manageable. I knew there were problems. I didn't know the extent. By the time I knew, it was too late to intervene without destroying everything at once." Mariana listened to him without interrupting. After a moment she asked, "And now what do you want to do?" It was a simple question, but it was the first time someone had asked it for real, without expecting an answer that served some specific interest. Henrique placed his coffee on the table and replied with the slow honesty of someone who is discovering what they think by saying it out loud. "I want to fix what can be fixed, and abandon what cannot." The coffee grew cold while they talked, and neither of them noticed. There was something in the quality of that morning, the light coming through the hotel window, the distant noise of the city still waking up, that made everything sharper than it used to be, as if the absence of affectation between the two of them created a space where things could exist in their real size, without the exaggeration or diminution that formal environments usually imposed. The days that followed the ball were different from what Henrique had predicted, not because things suddenly improved, but because he began to see them from an angle he wasn't used to. Mariana Furtado had returned to Brasilia on Sunday afternoon, but she had left behind a conversation that he continued to have internally, redoing segments, repositioning arguments, reaching conclusions that arrived late, but arrived nonetheless. He returned to Goiânia on Monday. The Valadares Montero Group's office was in the Marista sector, in a building constructed in the 90s that had been renovated twice, but still held in its corridors the feeling of an era when grandeur meant dark marble and wine-colored carpet. Henrique occupied the office of the operations director. He had never assumed the group's presidency, even after his father stepped down, because the presidency was a position that needed to be filled with care, not with haste. Magda, his assistant for 8 years, received him with a restrained smile and a pile of printed messages he hadn't answered. There was a culture in the group, inherited from Dirtsu, that important decisions went through physical paper. Henrique had never managed to completely eradicate this habit. "The Braga Cavalcantes confirmed the cancellation of Wednesday's meeting," Magda said without ceremony. She had learned that he preferred bad news without an introduction. "Expected," he replied. "Anything else?" "The Salgado and Associates law firm asked for additional time to deliver the opinion on the contracts with Coopazul, and Mr. Paranhos called yesterday afternoon." Henrique stopped. "Paranhos called here?" "He asked for a return call. He didn't leave a message." Gilberto Paranhos had never called the Valadares Montero office. Any contact between the two families had always been through lateral channels, an intermediary lawyer, a common accountant, a sector meeting where both were present by chance or by obligation. A direct call was unusual enough to be, depending on the angle, a threat or a proposal. Henrique did not return the call that day. At night, he sent a message to Mariana. He started writing something elaborate, deleted it, and started again with fewer words. "Something happened here that might be relevant to your type of work. Can I call you tomorrow?" The reply arrived in 4 minutes. "You can call now if you want." He called. He told her about Paranhos's call, about the Braga Cavalcante cancellation, about the growing feeling that there was a coordinated movement around the family group that he still couldn't completely map. Mariana heard everything without interrupting. She had this capacity for active silence, of listening in a way that made the speaker feel that every word was being recorded. "Do you have full access to the group's accounting?" she finally asked. "I do. I'm the operations director, but the financial area reported directly to my father. There are layers I'm still untangling. You would need someone from the outside to do that with more objectivity." "Someone like you?" A pause. "I am hired by another group here. It would be a conflict of interest." "But do you know someone?" "I know several people, but before recommending anyone, I want to understand one thing." Her voice was direct, as always, but there was something new in it, a caution that wasn't distrust, but care. "Do you want to do this to save the company, or because you genuinely want to know what happened?" "What's the difference?" "The difference is that saving the company might involve burying some things, and wanting to know what happened might destroy parts of it that you wanted to save. The two motivations lead to very different processes." Henrique was silent for a moment. Through the window of the apartment he kept in Goiânia, he saw the city lights stretching toward the south, indifferent to the questions he was trying to resolve. "I want to know what happened," he finally said. "Even if it's difficult." They talked for another 40 minutes. Mariana had worked for 6 years in one of the largest consulting firms in the country before setting up her own office in Brasilia. She specialized in corporate crisis situations, not image crises, which were the territory of another type of specialist, but structural crises, the ones that came from within and that no one wanted to see until it was impossible to ignore. There was something in the choice of this specialization, Henrique thought, that said something about who she was, someone who preferred to step in when the situation was difficult rather than arrive after everything had been resolved by others. In the following days, they spoke every day, sometimes by call, sometimes by message, always about some concrete aspect of the group's situation, a specific contract, a relationship with a supplier, a clause that had been renegotiated under conditions that Henrique now saw with different eyes. But the conversations always migrated at some point to other things, to their stories. He learned that she had grown up in Taguatinga, the daughter of an electronics technician and a public school teacher who had insisted that Mariana and her 2 brothers attend Federal University, that she had spent her adolescence convinced she was going to be a journalist before discovering in a summer internship that she had a disturbing talent for finding inconsistencies in numbers, that she had married at 28, divorced at 31, and that she spoke about it with the same objectivity with which she spoke about everything, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who examined the past and reached useful conclusions. Henrique told less than she did, not because he wanted to hide, but because there was a part of himself that was still learning to speak directly. Decades of a family culture where vulnerability was treated as weakness had left marks. But he was telling, bit by bit. Childhood on the farm, the complicated relationship with his father, the constant feeling of carrying a legacy whose terms he had never negotiated. It was on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the ball, that she said she would be in Goiânia on Friday to close a stage of the work with the client. She asked if he wanted to have dinner. He said yes, without hesitation. The restaurant he chose was in the Setor Sul, an old house converted with discreet good taste, without the ostentation that would be inappropriate for the moment, but with the care the occasion deserved. She arrived with a beige coat over her dress and a smile that was the same as at the ball, direct without protocol, but which now carried something different, built by weeks of conversations that had gone beyond the superficial. They had dinner for almost 3 hours. They talked about the group, about Goiânia, about a documentary series they had both coincidentally watched in the same week. And then she said, between one course and another, almost in passing, "You know that Paranhos Agro is trying to buy your group's debt from the bank, don't you?" The question arrived with a lightness that contrasted with the weight of what it contained. Henrique placed his cutlery on the plate and stared at her for a moment before replying, not because he needed time to understand, but because he wanted to be sure he had understood correctly. "Buy the debt," he repeated slowly. That's what's circulating. It's not confirmed, but their legal office's movements in the last few days point to that. Henrique was silent. Around them, the restaurant followed its Friday rhythm. Parallel conversations, the clink of cutlery, the low background music that no one heard consciously, but that everyone would notice if it stopped. A world completely oblivious to what was being said at that specific table, and there was something almost ironic in it, the ordinariness of the setting around a piece of information that changed everything. Henrique stood motionless for a second. Mariana's sentence had arrived with the casual lightness of someone mentioning something they consider obvious, and that lightness was precisely what made the information heavier. If she knew, there were others who knew. And if there were others who knew, the time available for a reaction was less than he had calculated. "How do you know this?" he asked. "The consulting market in Goiás is small. Less than 2 weeks ago, a colleague of mine was approached by the legal office representing Paranhos Agro to do a feasibility analysis of a debt acquisition. He refused due to a conflict of interest, but he told me. It's not a state secret. It's just information that hasn't reached you yet because no one who knows has an interest in warning you." Henrique placed his fork on the plate and looked at the table for a moment. A debt acquisition was an elegant mechanism. There was no direct confrontation, no public dispute. Paranhos would simply buy what the bank was owed by the Valadares Montero Group, and then, as a creditor, would have the power of pressure over assets, contracts, and decisions. It was a way to swallow without chewing. "The debt with the regional bank is from 18 months ago," Henrique said, more to himself than to her. "I knew it had been renegotiated under bad conditions, but I didn't know it was exposed like this." "It is, and if Paranhos assumes that creditor position, you will need to negotiate every step with someone who wants to see you disappear. Why are you telling me this?" The question came out harsher than he intended, but it was genuine. Mariana was hired by a competing group, had confidentiality obligations and enough conflicts of interest to justify silence. She had taken a step beyond what her professional position required. She didn't look away. "Because what I saw at that ball was unfair, and because I think you are trying to do the right thing in a situation that was made wrong before you had a voice in it. This doesn't mean I'm going to give up my professional ethics. I won't work for you while I'm hired by another group, but I won't stay quiet while someone uses an injustice as a springboard." Henrique stared at her for a long moment. There was in Mariana a kind of integrity that wasn't performative. She wasn't the type of person who announced her principles. She simply applied them without ceremony, as if they were as natural as breathing. It was disconcerting and, at the same time, exactly what he needed to be near at that moment. "What do I do?" he asked. "First, you need a lawyer specializing in debt restructuring who isn't the same as your father's, someone who works for you, not for the legacy. Then you need to understand precisely what is in the contracts with Kupasl, because my intuition says that's where the greatest fragility lies. And third," she paused, "you need to decide what you want to keep and what you are willing to give up." "I already said I want to fix what is possible." "Yes, but fixing is different from preserving. You can fix by leaving some parts behind. You need to be prepared for that." They returned to eating in silence for a few moments, a comfortable silence, the kind built between people who are comfortable with what doesn't need to be said. Outside, Goiânia passed indifferently through the night, the traffic on 85th Avenue, the bars of the Marista sector, the city that didn't know and didn't need to know about the issues two strangers were trying to resolve at a restaurant table. "Do you have family here?" she asked at a certain point, with a different, lighter tone. "My mother lives in Annapolis. She separated from my father 8 years ago before all this. It was the most sensible decision she made in her life, and at the time I didn't know how to recognize it. And now? Now I recognize it." A pause. "She called me when she heard about my father's removal. She said I needed to stop trying to save what he had built and start building what I wanted. I thought she was being simplistic. But she was right." Mariana smiled slightly. "Mothers are rarely wrong about that kind of thing. Is yours like that too? Mine used to say I thought too much and felt too little." A longer pause with something inside her that wasn't exactly sadness, but was a close relative of it. She passed away 4 years ago. Cancer. Too fast for us to prepare, but slow enough that I could be present at the end. I hold that with a lot of gratitude. Henrique didn't say anything immediately. He had learned by observing Mariana that there were moments when silence was the most respectful response. He waited a moment and then said only, "She must have been a remarkable woman." She was, and there was in her tone a peace that came from someone who has already made peace with a loss. She taught me that dignity doesn't depend on what people think of you. It depends on what you think of yourself when no one is looking. They left the restaurant near midnight. The Goiânia air in May had a dryness that came from the Cerrado, a smell of fine dust and burnt grass that Henrique had learned to associate with home, regardless of everything home had meant in terms of complications. They walked to Mariana's car, which she had parked on the street. In the farewell, there was a moment, brief but real, where the two of them stood at a distance smaller than the usual social distance, and neither of them pulled back. There was nothing more than a handshake that lasted a second longer than a handshake usually lasts, but that extra second said what neither of them had said yet. "Take care," she said. "You too. And thank you. For everything." She nodded with that sobriety that was her trademark and left. Henrique stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with the dry wind of the Cerrado passing through the street, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling that there was a direction. Not a certainty, not a guarantee, but a direction, and sometimes that was enough to start walking. The next morning he called the lawyer Tomás Avelar, a specialist in corporate restructuring who had been recommended by a professor at the business school where Henrique had done his postgraduate studies years ago. Tomás had worked on sensitive enough cases to understand that the first meeting should happen before any paper was signed. They scheduled it for the following Monday. Henrique spent the weekend reviewing documents, not just reading but truly understanding what was in each contract, what had been promised, what had been fulfilled, and what had been hidden in clauses that seemed harmless at first reading, but revealed their claws when someone read them with the attention of a predator. What he found was worse than he expected, and at the same time more organizable than he feared. It was a distinction that Tomás had learned to make over years of working with business families. Those who wanted to save the name rarely managed to save the company, and those who wanted to save the company rarely managed to save their soul. Henrique had chosen the third path, the most difficult and the only one that, in the lawyer's experience, tended to leave something real behind when everything ended. Tomás noted something on the pad in front of him and said, "I'm going to need full access to the email server from the period of 2022 to 2023, and the history of board meetings. The more complete, the better." "You'll have it," said Henrique. Tomás Avelar was a 52-year-old man who had spent his entire life in rooms where others didn't want to enter. He had the face of someone who had heard a lot of difficult things without needing to be protected from them. And he spoke with the precision of someone who knows that every word in a legal conversation can cost or earn a lot. When Henrique arrived at his office, in a sober building in the Setor Bueno, Tomás had already ordered coffee for two and had nothing on the table, which Henrique would later learn was his way of saying he was ready to hear everything. Henrique told everything. It took 2 hours. Tomás interrupted few times only to clarify dates or values. When Henrique finished, the lawyer was silent for almost a full minute, the kind of silence that isn't discomfort, it's processing. "Did you bring the contracts with Corpo Sul?" Tomás finally asked. "Here." Henrique placed the envelope on the table. Tomás opened it, leafed through it, stopped at a specific page. He read it twice. Then he placed the document on the table and looked at Henrique with an expression that contained in equal measure concern and something like professional curiosity. "Your father signed a revenue binding clause that committed 32% of the soybean crop production from the 3 main farms as collateral for this debt with Corpo Sul. If Paranhos Agro acquires this debt, as you suspect they will try to do, they won't just be a creditor. They will have rights over the production before you. Which means I work to pay Paranhos. During the renegotiation period, yes. And Paranhos can use this period to pressure for a deal that favors an asset sale. It's not a forced position, it's a suffocated position. You still have choices, but each of them goes over an obstacle built by this clause." Enrique stared out the window for a moment. Outside, the Setor Bueno passed in a Monday rhythm. Cars, bicycles, the muffled movement of a city that doesn't know what happens inside the offices where things are decided. What is possible to do? He asked. There are 3 paths. Tomás raised a finger. The first is to contest the clause legally, arguing that it was signed without the knowledge of the full executive board, which, if internal documents support it, could suspend its effects while the process runs. It's slow, it's uncertain, and it will create public exposure. He raised a second finger. The second is to renegotiate directly with Corposul before Paranhos completes the debt acquisition. If you offer better conditions than what Paranhos will offer, Corposul might prefer to deal with you. Creditors generally prefer money to legal complexity. He raised a third. The third is to agree to talk to Paranhos, but on your terms. Not as the party in need, but as the party that has information that makes the acquisition less advantageous than Paranhos thinks. What information? Tomás tilted his head slightly. That is what we need to find out. What do you know about Paranhos Agro's operations that they would prefer you didn't know? It was a question that echoed for days. Enrique returned to the office and spent the following week in a job he hadn't done systematically before, reconstituting the group's operational memory. Not the formal documents, which he already knew, but the informal ones, the emails that had remained on the backup server, the meeting minutes that had never been formalized, the travel and expense records that told stories parallel to the official accounting. It was corporate archaeology, and it required a patience he discovered he had. It was during this process that Mariana returned to Goiânia, this time for her own reasons. The audit she had performed for the other group had generated a report that needed to be presented in person. They met on Wednesday afternoon at a café in the Setor Oeste, and Enrique noticed there was something different about her, not in her posture or words, but in something more subtle, a lightness that hadn't been present the other times, as if a specific pressure had been resolved. "How was the presentation?" he asked. "Good." The client didn't like what they heard, but they recognized they needed to hear it. That's always the best possible result in a job like mine. "You like what you do." She considered the statement. "I like to believe that what I do has real utility. It's not glamorous. It's not the kind of work that makes people stop to listen to you at parties. But when it works, when someone manages to correct a course before the boat sinks for good, that's worth it." "Didn't you finish the contract with the other group?" "I did. I turned in the report yesterday." A measured pause. "Which means that technically there is no longer an immediate conflict of interest between our sides." Enrique understood what she was saying before she finished saying it. He was quiet for a moment, because he had learned that she preferred space to complete her thoughts. "I can do a preliminary analysis of your situation," Mariana said. "Not as a formal contract yet, but I can look at what you have and tell you what I see. If what I see justifies a larger engagement, we can talk about it in a structured way." "Why are you doing this?" The same question as before. She gave the same quality of answer, but with different words. "Because I'm curious," she said, "and because I think there is something here that can be resolved in a way that serves as an example. Situations like yours are more common than they seem. An heir who didn't choose the legacy, trying to do things differently without having the tools. If this works, it could be useful for more than one person." There was something in that explanation that was true and incomplete at the same time, and they both knew it. But there was also between them an undeclared understanding that some things could be said indirectly, while continuing to be understood directly. It was a tacit agreement of controlled honesty, enough honesty to move forward at the pace the situation demanded. "When do you want to start?" he asked. "Now, if you have the documents." He did. They spent the next 3 hours at the cafe with documents open on her laptop and coffee being refilled by a waiter who had learned not to interrupt. And while Mariana read and took notes, Enrique watched her work, the speed with which she processed information, the way she circled certain numbers with her pen, the slight frown that preceded an important question. It was during this session that she found something he had overlooked. "Enrique," she said, with a tone that was different from her usual one. "Look at this." He leaned over the laptop. It was an email from 18 months ago, between the group's chief accountant and an external address that Henrique didn't recognize. It took a few seconds for him to understand what he was reading, and when he understood, he felt his stomach drop, not from despair, but from the kind of drop that precedes a brutal and necessary clarity. "This changes everything," he said softly. "Yes," Mariana agreed, "but it can change in your favor." The waiter passed by the table and asked if they needed anything else. Both said no at the same time, and then looked at each other with the lightness of people who had inadvertently shared a rhythm. It was a small moment, unimportant to anyone outside, but it was these small moments that had been accumulating over the weeks, discreet, punctual, insistent, building something that neither of them had named yet, but that both recognized. The email was from a corporate address at Paranhos Agro. It wasn't from Gilberto Paranhos directly. It was from a financial director who had left the company 2 years earlier, in circumstances that at the time had been publicly described as an internal restructuring. The content was technical and partially encrypted in business language, but what was clear to anyone who read with attention was that there was direct communication between the Valadares Montero group's accountant and someone from Paranhos Agro at a time when the two groups should have been competitors, without any cooperative relationship. Mariana spent the next 30 minutes scouring the backup server for related messages. She found 7 more, all within the same 8-month period, all using language that became progressively less careful, as happens when people who should maintain discretion begin to feel too safe. "Oh, what you are seeing here," said Mariana with the careful calm of someone formulating a serious hypothesis, "is the possibility that part of your group's accounting irregularities were not committed exclusively from within. There may have been external facilitation." Henrique remained motionless. "You are saying that Paranhos was involved. I am saying that there is correspondence between your group's accountant and someone who worked for Paranhos Agro, occurring exactly during the period when the irregularities were practiced. I'm not saying it's proof of anything. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an investigator, but I am saying that this needs to reach Tomas Avelar today." He called the lawyer while they were still at the cafe. Tomas asked them to digitize everything and send it via encrypted email. 2 days later, he requested an urgent meeting. The meeting took place on a Friday morning, with Tomas, Henrique, and a documentary forensics specialist the lawyer had summoned. The expert, a calm man named Raimundo, who spoke of corporate fraud with the same serenity that other people speak of gardening, spent 2 hours analyzing the documents, and at the end gave an opinion that contained the word Henrique was expecting and fearing in equal measure: relevant. "There is enough consistency in this set of documents to support a line of investigation," said Raimundo. "I cannot state with certainty what happened, but I can state that what is here is incompatible with the narrative that the irregularities were exclusively internal." Tomas joined his hands on the table. "This gives us 2 options we didn't have before. The first is to take this to a regulatory body, which opens a formal process and exposes everyone involved, including your group. The second is to use this information in a direct negotiation with Paranhos before any formal instance is activated." "Which do you recommend?" asked Henrique. "It depends on what you want. If the goal is punishment, go to the regulatory body. If the goal is the survival of the group with recoverable reputation, use this as a bargaining chip to end the dispute before it reaches a court." Henrique stared at the documents on the table. There was a part of him that wanted the formal instance, that wanted to see that processed, recorded, corrected by a system that went beyond the 2 parties. But there was another part that knew well the cost of long processes in a sector where reputation was circulating capital. During years of litigation, the group would be paralyzed, without access to credit, without the capacity to operate normally, without the possibility of rebuilding. "Negotiate," he finally said, "but on terms that ensure the group will not be absorbed, and that leave enough recorded so that what happened cannot simply be swept under the rug." Tomas nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who was satisfied with the answer. "That I can do." Mariana learned of the meeting's result that afternoon, via message. She replied with few words. "Good decision. Now it's wait for Tomas to work." But waiting wasn't easy. The following days were the longest Henrique had lived in a long time, not because of the intensity of external events, but because of their silence. Tomás had initiated contact with Paranjos's legal office without revealing the full content of what he had found. It was a slow-motion negotiation where every word was chosen to not reveal nor hide too much. Meanwhile, life went on. The office functioned. Employees came and went. The farm fields had their own agenda that didn't care about corporate disputes. The soybeans grew because that's what soybeans did, indifferent to the human tensions around them. Mariana returned to Brasilia. They continued to talk daily, but the conversations had changed in nature. They had stopped being exclusively about the crisis and had begun to include other things. She told him about a consulting project she was putting together to serve family businesses in generational transition. A specific niche, she said, that no one served properly because it involved skills most consultancies didn't have, part technical, part psychological, part simple human presence. He told her about the farm where he had grown up, the Fazenda Olhos d'Água, smaller than Santa Veronica, but with a preserved native cerrado that his father had wanted to convert into pasture, and that he had defended with a stubbornness that, in retrospect, was one of the few clashes from which he had emerged victorious. "You have an attachment to the land," she said, in one of those nightly conversations that had become part of the day's structure. "I do. It's complicated because the land here isn't just the land. It's history, relationships, what my grandparents built before any irregularity existed. I don't want that to disappear along with my father's mistakes. It doesn't have to." She said this with the conviction of someone who reached a conclusion before verbalizing it. A patrimony can be reconstituted on different foundations. The past doesn't define the future unless we let it. There were nights when Henrique finished the phone call and stayed awake for a long time, not out of anxiety, but out of something harder to name, something that was the opposite of the loneliness he had felt at the ball 3 weeks earlier. As if that lonely conversation with the bedroom ceiling at Fazenda Santa Veronica were being answered, gradually by a presence he hadn't asked for but had needed. In the 3rd week after Tomás began negotiations, the message he was waiting for arrived. Paranjos Agro had accepted a meeting to present a proposal. Henrique read the message 3 times, then he called Mariana. "They accepted," he said. "I know," she replied. "Tomás told me he would call you next." A brief pause. "Are you ready?" "I am." And he realized, as he said it, that it was true. Tomás had explained the strategy clearly. It wasn't about presenting the documents as an accusation, but as context, as information that existed and that both sides had an interest in being treated with discretion. It was the difference between using a weapon and showing that you have one. And Henrique had learned, watching Mariana work, that the second option was almost always more effective than the first. Confirmation of the meeting arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Henrique read Tomás's email in the office, with Magda in the next room and the distant sound of a routine phone call coming from the hallway. He stared at the screen for a moment, then closed the computer, grabbed his coat and left earlier than he usually did, something he rarely did, but that afternoon seemed necessary. He walked for 40 minutes through Parc Flamboyant, on the way from the office to the apartment, with no specific destination within the park. Just walking, letting the physical movement process what the mind needed to organize. Children ran near the lake. Couples walked at different rhythms, some in silence, some in animated conversation. The park knew nothing and didn't need to know. The meeting took place in a neutral office, a conference room rented in a Goiânia hotel, chosen by Tomás precisely because it didn't belong to either side. There was something revealing in this kind of choice. When neither party agrees to go to the other's territory, neutral ground becomes the only possible terrain for any conversation to happen. Gilberto Paranjos arrived with 2 lawyers and an assistant who stayed near the door the whole time, with the posture of someone used to witnessing conversations they shouldn't repeat. Paranjos was 61 years old, shorter than he appeared from a distance at the ball, and had the manners of someone who had learned to exercise power in a way that left others thinking the initiative was theirs. He looked at Henrique with the same kind of contained satisfaction he had shown at the ball, only now there was something different in that look, a sharper attention, as if he had realized the scenery had changed in some way he didn't yet fully understand. On Henrique's side were Tomás Avilar and Raimundo, the expert. Mariana was not in the room. It wouldn't be appropriate, given that she had until recently been hired by a group with relations to both parties. But she was available by message, and Henrique had spent the last few hours before the meeting in preparation that she had conducted with the methodological precision that was her trademark. Each argument positioned, each concession calibrated, each pressure point identified and located on the negotiation map. Tomás opened the meeting with deliberate formality, introducing the parties for the record and establishing the scope of the conversation. Paranhos agreed to all of this with the easy smile of someone who thought he was in a position of advantage and saw no reason to disguise it. "We understand," said Paranhos's lawyer, "that the Valadares Montero Group faces significant difficulties regarding its debt with the regional bank and contractual commitments with Cupasul. We are here to explore if there is a solution structure that benefits both parties." The sentence was elegant and completely transparent in its real meaning. "We are here to offer a purchase price and see if you accept." Tomás replied with equal elegance, "We appreciate the willingness." Before discussing any solution structure, we would like to present some information that arose during the internal review of the Valadares Montero Group's documents, and that seems relevant to the context of this negotiation. Raimundo placed a thin folder on the table, not bulky, not dramatic, just a thin folder with organized documents. And he began to explain what he had found. The effect was gradual, as Tomás had calculated. In the first few minutes, Paranhos's lawyers maintained neutral expressions. After a few minutes, one of them raised a technical objection about the validity of the documents. Raimundo replied with the calm of someone who expected exactly that objection and had the answer ready. The second lawyer began to take notes with an intensity he hadn't shown at the beginning of the meeting. Gilberto Paranhos stayed quiet. That silence was the most important information in the room. Paranhos was a man who operated through speech. He controlled conversations, redirected subjects, used tone and volume as tools. His silence, at that specific moment, said that he had recognized something he didn't expect to find there. "What are you proposing?" he finally said, cutting off the lawyer who was formulating an additional objection. Tomás leaned slightly forward. "We are proposing a clean closure of the ongoing disputes. The Valadares Montero Group recognizes the internal irregularities of the period preceding the current management and is committed to a structured reparation process with the competent authorities. In return, we expect that any acquisition of debt with the regional bank be abandoned, that the contracts with Cupasul be renegotiated under conditions that reflect the group's real payment capacity, and that the set of documents we presented today be treated with appropriate discretion that naturally also commits us to maintain." It was the proposal Henrique had built with Mariana over 3 days. It didn't ask for impunity. It didn't ask for anything to be forgotten. It asked for space to fix things the right way, without being destroyed in the process by a party that had contributed to the problem. Paranhos's lawyers asked for a 30-minute suspension. They went out into the hallway with their client. Henrique stayed in the room with Tomás and Raimundo. No one spoke. There was a glass of water in front of him, and he drank it slowly, because he needed to do something with his hands. He sent a message to Mariana. "We presented." They went out to deliberate. The reply arrived in seconds. "Breathe. You did what was right to do." When Paranhos returned, there was something different in his manners. It wasn't surrender. Paranhos wasn't the type of man who surrendered in a visible way, but it was a reconfiguration. The smile of satisfaction had disappeared. What remained was the posture of someone who is recalculating. "We can work with the structure you proposed," he said, addressing Henrique directly for the first time since the beginning of the meeting, ignoring the lawyers, as if suddenly the negotiation were between the people and not between the offices. "With some conditions." "I'm listening to the conditions," Henrique said. The conditions were reasonable, more reasonable than Henrique had expected, which revealed that Paranhos had arrived at the meeting with room for maneuver that he hadn't intended to use, but now saw a reason to use. They were adjustments in deadlines, a reciprocal non-disclosure clause, a commitment not to litigate for 2 years while the structured reparation process took place. Tomas and Paranhos's lawyers spent the next hour working out the language. In the end, there was a memorandum of understanding, not a definitive contract, but the skeleton of an agreement that the lawyers on both sides would formalize in the following weeks. When the meeting ended and everyone else left, Henrique was alone for a moment in the empty room. He looked at the table, at the glasses of water, at the window overlooking a covered parking lot where no one was paying attention. There was something there that wasn't exactly victory. It was more like the specific relief of when a heavy load is placed on the ground, not because you threw it away, but because you finally found the right place to set it down. He called Mariana. "We closed," he said. He heard her exhale on the other end of the line. "How was it?" Paranhos went quiet when Raimundo presented the documents. He was quiet long enough for me to know the deal was going to be possible. "And how are you?" The simple question again, the one she always knew how to ask at the right moment. "I am," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I am." Tomas met him in the hallway and shook his hand with the firmness of someone who knows there is nothing left to do except execute. "Well done," said the lawyer, with the economy of words of someone who only uses them when they are necessary. Raimundo said goodbye with a nod and left toward the elevator, already with his phone in hand, probably calling the office to report the result. Henrique stayed one more moment in the room and then left too. In the hotel lobby, a group of executives awaited the elevator with the characteristic urgency of someone who has their next appointment in 15 minutes. Henrique passed them without crossing glances, went through the revolving door, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with the afternoon October sun hitting the side of his face. Goiânia in October had a heat that wasn't just temperature. It was a physical, concrete presence that constantly reminded you where you were and that there was nowhere else in the world with that specific heat. He had grown up with that heat. He had tried in some difficult moments of life to imagine what it would be like to live somewhere else. He had never been able to truly imagine it. He was from here, and it would be from here that he would rebuild. In the months following the Memorandum of Understanding, the Valadares Montero group went through what Mariana called a careful disassembly. Not a collapse, but an organized dismantling of the parts that no longer served, followed by a reconstruction on foundations that Henrique could, for the first time, call his own. The process was not silent or painless. The competent authorities were notified as the agreement established, and the group went through an external audit that lasted almost 4 months. There were weeks when the employees looked at Henrique with that mixed expression of loyalty and uncertainty of someone who doesn't know if the ground they are on will continue to exist. He made a point of being present, of being accessible, of not disappearing into the kind of absence that image crises sometimes produce in leaders who don't know how to face them head-on. The Fazenda Olhos d'Água was preserved. Henrique had predicted from the beginning that he would give up assets to honor the reparation commitments, and that is what he did, with 2 smaller farms that were sold under fair conditions to buyers who had no relation to Paranhos Agro. Olhos d'Água remained because it was where the roots were oldest, and because the native cerrado that his grandfather had preserved against all commercial pressures deserved to continue existing. Mariana formalized the consulting contract with the group in October. It was a 12-month engagement, renewable, specifically aimed at the governance transition process, the construction of an independent advisory board, the review of internal control mechanisms, the mapping of relations with suppliers and partners that needed to be re-evaluated in light of new criteria. It was technical, demanding work that involved many hours on documents and many difficult conversations with people who preferred the comfortable imprecision of the past to the uncomfortable clarity of the present. But there was also, in the intervals between meetings, something else. They hadn't spoken directly about what was between them, not with the words that name those things, not with the formality of a declaration. There was an understanding that had grown organically over the months, fed by nightly conversations and dinners in Goiânia, and a visit she had made to Fazenda Olhos d'Água on a September weekend, when the cerrado still held the last blooming ipés of the season. On that weekend, they had walked along a path that crossed the native field, with the afternoon sun slanted and the smell of dry grass that was the specific perfume of that cerrado. Mariana had stopped in front of a tall buriti that grew near a marshy path and stayed silent for a moment, with her hand on the palm's rough bark. "You are lucky," she finally said. "To have this?" he asked. "To know that you have this." She turned to him. "Many people go through life without finding the place that is theirs. You have yours, and you know it's yours. That is rare. That is. Don't you have a place like that?" She thought before answering. "I had my mother's apartment in Taguatinga, but after she was gone, I sold it. I couldn't stay there without every room being a memory that hurt more than it comforted. Since then, I carry home in a suitcase. Does that get tiring?" "Sometimes." A pause. "But sometimes I find places that seem like they could be home without me needing to live in them." She looked at the buriti again, and there was in her profile an expression he had learned to recognize, the expression of someone who is saying more than the words are saying. He didn't answer immediately. He stood beside her, looking at the buriti, feeling the dry afternoon wind passing through the path, and then said with the calmness of someone who reached a conclusion that had been maturing for a long time, "You could stay if you wanted." She looked at him. "In the Cerrado?" "In Goiânia, near here." A pause. "Near me." It was the most direct declaration he had made in many years. It was simple, without ornament, without the elaborate vocabulary his world usually used to mask intentions, and she received it in the same way, with the quiet honesty that was her language. "Are you asking me to change my life for you?" she asked without accusation, genuinely curious about the answer. "No," he said. "I'm telling you that, if you decide, I want you to know there is space, not as a requirement, as an invitation." Mariana stayed silent for a long moment, her eyes on the cerrado that stretched beyond the path. In the distance, a white heron slowly crossed the horizon. "Can I think about it?" she finally said. "Take all the time you need." She took 2 months. Not because she was undecided. Anyone who knew Mariana Furtado knew she didn't take long to know what she wanted, but because there were practical things to resolve. The office in Brasilia, the ongoing clients, the structure of a life that had been built in one city, and now asked for a rearrangement that wasn't simple. She made that rearrangement with the same methodicalness with which she did everything, without drama, but with attention to every detail. In December, she moved the office headquarters to Goiânia. The decision was not announced as a romantic gesture. It was presented by her as a strategic decision. The Goiás market for corporate governance consulting for family businesses was expanding. The proximity to agribusiness clients was advantageous. There were opportunities that Brasilia didn't offer in the same way. All of that was true. And there were also other reasons that didn't need to be presented at any meeting. On the day she arrived with the boxes for the apartment she had rented in the Setor Marista, 15 minutes away from the group's office, which was a professional convenience and also something else, Henrique showed up with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. They put up the shelves, organized the books in an order she determined, and he executed without question, and they had dinner sitting on the floor because the table hadn't arrived from the transport company yet. It was the simplest dinner Enrique had had in years, and it was the best. That year, the Valadares Monteiro Group closed the audit process with a report that for the first time in the company's history was entirely transparent. It wasn't a pretty report. It recorded errors, it recorded omissions, it recorded consequences. But it was honest, and there was a specific dignity in that honesty that Henrique had learned to value above any appearance of perfection. The advisory board was installed in February of the following year, with 5 independent members and transparency criteria that made it impossible to repeat what had been done before. It was an imperfect mechanism, as all human mechanisms are imperfect, but it was one that had been built with intention. Dirceu Valadares Monteiro, the father, remained away from the business. They saw each other on family dates, the mother's birthday, an occasional holiday, with the careful cordiality of people who carry a complicated history between them, and opted, each in their own way, not to reopen what can no longer be changed. There was no reconciliation in the dramatic sense, nor a definitive rupture. There was something harder and more mature, The acceptance that the love between father and son can coexist with profound disagreement on how to live. Henrique learned this bit by bit, in the same way he learned other things, slowly with initial resistance, reaching the conclusion later than he could have, but reaching it nonetheless. 2 years after the ball of the traditional agribusiness families at Fazenda Santa Veronica, Henrique Valladares Montero received an invitation to the same event. He stared at the envelope for a moment. It was the same cream paper as always, the same calligraphy printed in gold, the same coat of arms of the host family in the upper left corner, in every way identical to the invitation he had received 2 years earlier, except for what it meant to receive it this time. At that first ball, his presence had been tolerated. The invitation had arrived by inertia, because the Valladares Montero name was still on the historical list, even if the surname was under a shadow. 2 years later, the invitation arrived with a handwritten note from the host, Rodrigo Braga Cavalcante, saying it would be an honor to count on Enrique's presence and that there was much to celebrate in the sector. Much to celebrate. It was the language reserved for those who had returned. He took the envelope to the kitchen of Mariana's apartment. They had begun to share space informally in recent months, without announcing it and without denying it, and placed it on the counter while she prepared coffee. "What is this?" she asked without looking, because there was something in his silence that said it was something. "Invitation to the agribusiness family's ball." She turned around. She read the note. She returned the envelope to the counter with her usual calmness. "Are you going?" she asked. "Depends." "On what?" "On you wanting to go with me." Mariana stayed silent for a moment with the cup in her hands, and then a small, almost imperceptible smile passed across her face, the kind she saved for moments when something surprised her in a good way. "I have nothing to wear," she said. "You looked beautiful last time with the dress you had." "I was working. I wasn't trying to look beautiful." "Well, you did anyway." She placed the cup on the counter and looked at him with the seriousness that preceded the things she said for real. "Enrique, you don't need to return to that hall to prove anything." "I know." He took the invitation and folded it back into the envelope. "But I want to go, not to prove anything, to show up as the person I chose to be. There is a difference." She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Then I'm going to need a new dress." The ball took place on a Friday in May, with the same scenery as always. Ipes, chandeliers, orchestra, the specific perfumery of an environment where power and etiquette have lived together for decades. Henrique arrived with Mariana at exactly 9 o'clock, with the same punctuality as 2 years before, but with something fundamentally different. He arrived with her. The hall noticed, not with fanfare, not with drama, but with that silent and collective attention that halls like that exercise when something changes. Rodrigo Braga Cavalcante came to meet them near the entrance and greeted Henrique with an effusiveness that was genuine enough not to need to be overanalyzed. He introduced himself to Mariana with the respect reserved for people who built their own reputation, because Mariana had built one. In the Goiás corporate environment, her name had established itself with the speed that good work has when delivered with consistency. The final report of the Valladares Montero Group's governance process had circulated in a summarized version among 2 or 3 groups in the sector by word-of-mouth recommendation, and had generated inquiries that she was converting into new contracts. It was the kind of trajectory that is built without being announced, and that announces itself. They danced. Not the waltz of the first time, not with the urgency of a gesture of redemption, but a waltz of people who are present in that moment and in no other place at the same time. He held her differently now, not with the contained tension of a man who needs to appear stable, with the lightness of someone who found the right weight for his own shoulders. "You are different," she said near his ear, as they turned slowly. "Different how?" "Like someone who is no longer trying to hold themselves back." He considered that. It was a good way to describe it. For a long time, much of his energy had been spent on containment, containing the anguish over his father, containing the anger over the sector's injustices, containing the desire to be different from what the legacy demanded. Containing and containing until the effort became invisible, until he himself forgot that there was something being contained. He didn't have to contain anymore, not because the problems had disappeared, life didn't work that way, but because he had found a way of being in the world that was more like who he really was. A man who had erred by staying quiet for too long, who had learned the price of silence and decided he preferred the price of honesty, however high it was. Throughout the night, he noticed there was something different in the way people approached, not the automatic deference of the times when the surname alone opened doors. That had changed and would not return in the same way. It was a different approach, more considered, more honest, as between adults who know more about what is at stake. He preferred that. Gilberto Paranhos was present. Henrique saw him from afar, in conversation with a group from southwest Goiás, and their eyes met for a moment. There was no longer a smile of satisfaction. There was only the neutral recognition of two men who know enough about each other to maintain a respectful distance. It was the kind of relationship Enrique could accept. On the last dance of the night, the orchestra played a slow choro that no one had asked for, but that fit perfectly at that hour. That moment at the end of an event when the environment's energy is already lowering and people are more themselves than they have been the whole night. Mariana and Henrique stopped in the middle of the floor. "Do you remember what you said to me when you invited me to dance for the first time?" he asked. "I asked if you were still going to dance that waltz or if you had already given up. I said I hadn't given up on anything." "And you had," she said without cruelty. "You were leaving." "Yes, but when you asked, I realized I didn't want to." He looked at her. It was the most important thing anyone had said to me in a long time, and it wasn't even a thing. It was a question. She was silent for a moment, with that capacity of hers to inhabit silence without haste. Then she said, "The right questions are worth more than most answers." They left the ball near midnight, with the Goiás air in May carrying the distant smell of earth and cerrado that Henrique had learned to love before he knew he loved it. The parking lot was lit by floodlights that cast long shadows on the asphalt. He stopped before opening the car. He turned to her. There was no speech. There were no prepared words. There was only the question that had waited for the right moment to be asked, not with urgency, not with anxiety, but with the calmness of someone who reached a certainty slowly and is in no hurry to leave it. "Stay," he said. One word. The same one he had said in the Cerrado, near the Buriti, months earlier. But this time it sounded different, not like an open invitation for a possible future, but like the recognition of something that had already begun to exist and only needed to be named. Mariana looked at him for a long moment, and then she replied in the only way that fit. She stayed. There in that parking lot, leaning lightly on his shoulder while the orchestra's music arrived muffled by the hall's walls. She stayed. Because some stories don't begin with grand gestures. They begin with a simple question asked to the right person at the moment they most needed to hear it. And they end, when they end well, not with an end, but with a beginning that finally has the right name. If this story reached you, dear listener, it is because you also know what it is like to carry a weight you did not choose and to look, along the way, for someone who does not retreat before it. For us, here on the channel, every story like this is a way to remember that destiny is not tied to the past. It is in the choices we make when everything seems lost. If you want to continue on this journey, subscribe to our channel right now, leave your like, and write in the comments which part of this story touched you most deeply. Every day we bring new stories that explore the complexity of life, human strength, and the unexpected beauty of connections that change everything. Don't miss the next chapter of our programming. It was made with you in mind. End of story.